environmental sustainability, social cohesion, and long-term development outcomes. This evidence suggests that with deliberate choices by powerful stakeholders, mining can support inclusive growth rather than deepen inequality.
Good morning. My name is Sikhululegile Mashingaidze, SKU in short. Thank you so much, Vusi and Douglas, and thank you, Stephen Mishka, for leading the way. I'm going to talk about Zimbabwe. I want to start off with I love short stories. I want to talk about rather interesting conversations that developed after President Mugabe, when he turned 92, that must have been in 2016, and he echoed that $15 billion revenue was missing from the Marange diamond mining projects. If there are Zimbabweans in the room, I'm sure you may remember that particular incident. Some of the interesting conversations from there, or the jokes, or the memes, as you would say these days, that people came up with were 15 billion. How many are we in this country? How much would I have got as an individual, right? And so there were all these jokes, but again, at the same time, a reality on everyday existence to say, if that mining revenue was translated to transform my life as a community member, what would it do for me, right? So people started thinking in terms, individually, in terms of, we could have shared so many dollars amongst ourselves. So I just thought I'd just start off with that story to just bring the story closer to the everyday existence. The stories of mining, the processing and the planning happens right up there, but it is the community members who live with the blunt realities every day. Okay. And so today I just want to share on the Zimbabwe focus of the project, strengthening community-centered resource governance in Mbire and Mzarabani districts. These are districts in Zimbabwe's Mashonaland Central Province. And this is where Invictus Energy is exploring for oil and gas. I'll request that you move a bit further on or maybe just hold it right there, but I would want us to move way further than the next 3 slides, because Vusi's introduction already touched on some of that. Okay, I'm not going to use that. Okay, so as Vusi indicated, the first phase of our project was in 2022, and the second phase was last year. These are the developments as far as Invictus project processes are concerned since our last time there to date. So in 2024, it had a strategic funding support or commitment of $10 million from the Mutapa Investment Fund. The Mutapa Investment Fund is Zimbabwe's sovereign wealth fund. And then it also was awarded national project status in 2025. And then also went into an agreement with the Qatari Al Mansour Holdings. And then in 2025 again, the Petroleum Production Sharing Agreement process, they announced that it had been completed. And then this year, Invictus Energy announced termination of the Al Mansour Holdings agreement. There is awareness in terms of the process on how the process is going at that level, at the elite level, at the lead in at community level. Yes, there's all that engagement with partners, with strategic partners that support. The Sovereign Fund is about the country's community involvement is there. You can move to the next slide. Okay, we already touched on that. We can proceed to the next one. Okay, maybe just a brief profile of the Mbire and Mzarabani districts where Invictus Energy is exploring for oil. So these are communities with a combined total of at least 217,000 plus in terms of their population, but this is in 2022, right, according to the 2022 Food and Nutrition Survey. And then, obviously, face extreme poverty challenges, infrastructure deficits, chronic food insecurity, and climate vulnerability. So our research, the hope is that our research, or the intention is that our research can speak into how the government and investment partners can be intentional in ensuring that revenue translates to transforming the condition of community members in these mining, in the host communities. We can move to the next slide. Kindly proceed. Okay, so the second phase of our project is focusing on justice in transition. What would that mean for communities? It is very convenient that this particular project is coming in the energy space because of the energy needs, not only of the Mbire and Mzarabani communities, but of Zimbabwe and the region as well. So this is how we approached this particular project. We wanted to find out community views based on the issues that you see there. So we wanted to understand community experiences as far as mining-related projects in general are concerned. We wanted to find out what mining activities or projects are taking place in their communities, to what extent are they involved, impact of mining on girls and women, detailed manner, and you see resonance as you go, whether you're in Zimbabwe, in Zambia, or in Mozambique. And then communities first to know how much they are trickling down, particularly to the rural communities. And then household energy as well, given that Invictus Energy is coming into the energy space. And then we also wanted to understand the status of community infrastructure, some of which you don't really need to ask about. You just need to drive through, and you can also already witness the state of the roads on your own. And then we also wanted to understand the community level forums and other civil society organizations in these particular communities, partly because it's a ruling party they are ruling party strongholds, so that access to certain kinds of information, particularly on such a project of this level and of such sensitivity. We can move on. Okay, so our findings on mining-related projects and consultation processes, there was mention of chrome and gold mining in certain areas. For example, in brackets there, that's the name of a mine called Chinofu. But they indicated that, our respondents indicated that it's mainly artisanal mining. They could not reference particular structured formal mining, reference a particular company. And then Invictus Energy, interestingly, wasn't readily cited in most of our focus group discussions. And our deduction was that this may be because we operate in a very constrained civic for more direct, regular community updates throughout project phases. That's what we observed. When they then talked about Invictus Energy, there was indication that some were not very much aware about what is going on. And yet there are all those developments that I've talked about. For example, remember I began with the different processes that the project has undergone. Okay. Kindly move to the next one. Okay, so you'll find that here and there, I like to just extract some statements as they were given by community respondents. So on employment, for example, one of them says, Invictus Oil and Gas Company managed to recruit its own workers, excluding majority of local people in Mzarabani. So community expectation is that there should at least be some benefit as Invictus is exploring, or any investor is coming in to explore in terms of boosting local employment. Community members appreciate that they may not have the expertise required and contribute meaningfully and also benefit. And this is so important in the context of our high unemployment rates, particularly youth unemployment. And then they talked about chizivano, that's a Shona word. Shona is one of Zimbabwe's languages, for those who may not know. So chizivano, where they said it's about who you know, the influence of political affiliation and personal networks. That is what may determine your access to employment opportunities. Able to whether exploit those opportunities to let some of their family members or friends or networks secure. One of the respondents said that only 2 in Mbire and only a few in Mzarabani were skepticism as well about the project. This sense that if at this level there is no sense of transparency even about how people are recruited, what is the likelihood that any revenue is going to trickle to the generality of the community anyway? So there's a call for transparent, merit-based systems that create equitable access to opportunities. So that is what the residents or the community members were calling for. And like I already indicated, they're saying there are non-expert roles that could be specifically reserved for locals. We can proceed. And then on environmental and social, in the experiences, some kind of phrase, this woman respondent said, "Huipi uri kungotenderera," a vicious, which I summed up as a vicious cycle of depravity, because that's how she framed it. And she says the social ills that come with mining, or that have come with mining in some communities, require high-level government intervention because they are beyond the capacity of parents, teachers, and local leadership. So you'll find a relationship. You want jobs, you want the revenue, but the social fragmentation and the social ills and their enduring nature are they're just not worth whatever revenue comes, which doesn't eventually trickle back to the community anyway. So in terms of education, increase in dropout rates, young people, some young people, pupils and students consider mining an easier route to making money, because the school is always considered the longer route, because occasionally you have young people who go mining and they strike a couple of $1,000 US, and they're looking at their teacher and practically aware that their teacher is earning so much per month and wondering, why should I spend 7 years at primary school, 4 years at secondary school, 2 years at university, 4 years maybe for another level of studies, only to eventually find my way out to the United Kingdom to be a, what do they call them? Health workers, I've forgotten the term. Right, so that's the reality in Zimbabwe. In most communities, where young people are saying, what's the point of education, right? And it's even worse. We may proceed. Okay, and then these are communities characterized by high flood vulnerability because of their low-lying terrain. More than 70% of Mbire households were assessed or have been assessed as highly vulnerable to flooding. Also, at the receiving end of climate, the potential negative impact on the community's water resources as well. Mining is water intensive, as experts here would better explain. The likely contribution to greenhouse gas emissions are all concerns about this project that is currently going on. We move on. School dropouts earlier, element and in mind. So also that already tells you about how women suffer, intersectional layers of the constraints that come with mining. The phase of a mining project, but there are roads, not. The roads are from Mahuwe, a tiny stretch, 20-kilometer stretch of 180 kilometer stretch completed. And then in point, your urbanish kind of setup for Mbire district. Motorbikes serve as the primary transport mode because they are cheaper and they can easily navigate the gullies. And then in terms of education, education was described as being, there's this very strong, should I call it, culture in Zimbabwe where education is taking place more in private settings, your private lessons, if I may put it that way. Not much is taking place. This is in the public school system. Not much learning taking place within the classroom, but the very same teachers also running private lessons for students because it raises better revenue for them, right? And so more effective teaching taking place in those spaces. So in Madzomba and Nyambudzi areas, schools need classroom blocks and sanitation facilities. The secondary schools were also reported to be quite distant from some communities, which also leads to poor performance and dropouts. In Mzarabani, parents particularly expressed an interest in privately owned schools, which points to a declining confidence in public education. Why that last point is significant is because the tendency is not to, we don't associate privately owned schools with our rural areas. It's an urban phenomenon. But in this particular community, there was interest because of that lack of confidence in public education. We move on. Okay, in terms of healthcare facilities, public healthcare facilities were described as totally collapsed, paralyzed and in intensive care unit, and resorting to private health institutions is one of the alternatives that community members have, but only for those who can afford it. And then, interestingly, because of the border proximity, some community members go as far as Zambia and Mozambique, where they own. Okay, and then in terms of energy access, which is of particular interest in the context of Invictus Energy. So energy options are limited. Firewood for most, which was cited as the most common, but now rather difficult to access and to use, and massive siltation along the Hunyani and the confluence. Gas as well is preferred, especially by girls and women, for its speed and convenience, but is expensive and was noted to be about $2.50 a kg. So what we gathered from this conversation is that communities are already in transition in terms of energy use, and it better informs whoever is coming in to address such issues to know how to assist them because of our grid, but we've highlighted there, reveal communities' priorities as far as what would be ideal or smart partnership on its sustainability section on their website. They talk about what they call shared prosperity approach. So prosperity approach. We know that for some investors, sometimes it's a tick box exercise. You know what to say, you know what to present. This is what we intend, better inform them in terms of shaping that shared prosperity approach as far as community benefit is concerned. So there is scope to address immediate hardship and long-term development constraints. And some felt, like I said, there's this mining project in our community at all. But some felt it could address unemployment challenges. And so there was a call for good governance, or a plea for good governance in the sector. The project is a significant opportunity and considerable responsibility for Zimbabwe's energy future, but as well as for the region's energy future, should Invictus Energy strike or make a commercially viable find. So we wait to see if that happens. And then it's currently at the exploration phase, and because of that, this is an opportunity to strengthen governance frameworks ahead of production to avert the resource curse. And then policy recommendations. So policy recommendations from the first phase of our research still stand. You may find these on our website, on our report on the first phase of the project. I'll run through the current ones. So the need for comprehensive community-wide timelines, all those processes really need to be transparently handled. And a point to that as well, there is need to also offer this information in indigenous languages. So there's need to really provide that translation, so that, because not everyone is conversant with English, there's all that information even on the website, but for those who may not be conversant, and again, the language is extremely technical. It's comprehensible to people who understand what it's all about. But some of our community members, yes, some are quite literate and they can comprehend, but we need to translate some of that. And then local level representation in governance structures. So the first phase of our project, we observed that whatever has been called consultation at community level is with what we may call your everyday, for lack of a better word, ordinary community member. So the suggestion is to ensure local level representation in governance structures, clearly defined benefit sharing mechanisms, and then publish transparent, merit-based employment criteria, so as to ensure that communities who are host to these mining projects really can happen. As I conclude, just to go back to the legal framework around oil and gas mining in Zimbabwe, it's such that the rights of mining are conferred and signed by the president. So there are all these agreements that have been put in place. They haven't been made public, but there doesn't seem to be room as well to ensure that these can be made public because of the constraining nature of the fact that these are conferred with the president, and it almost seems like an exclusive space with very limited room to influence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Siku, Mishka, are some of the key issues and challenges, while also highlighting the similarities despite the different levels of development happening in these countries. Before we pause for our comfort break to have some coffee and tea, I'd like to get David Mapumuze, who is the lead researcher at the Africa Institute of Environmental Law, who will share some of the findings from the benchmarking study that was commissioned by GRI, and also share on the economic labor impacts of mining and how we can really strengthen governance frameworks and make way for responsible mining. Please hold off your questions, comments, and real solutions and interventions upon our second panel discussion after the coffee break. Thank you. David?
No, thanks. Good morning. I was just checking with the minutes that I have because I can tell that I'm standing between tea break and people seem to have had a long session in the morning. So, no, thanks. So my name is David. I'm coming from IO. We are a research think tank based in Zimbabwe. We cover South Africa, Zambia, and Namibia. Our primary focus is to look at resource issues, sustainability issues in the region. We are very keen to understand how mining companies impact the communities, how we can work with the communities as well to give them capacity building, to ensure that they can also hold the mining companies to account in terms of how the mining companies are operating. So it's a two-way relationship that we're really focusing on, capacity building the mining companies themselves, to understand the journey of mining companies in terms of ESG, and also working very closely with the with the communities, the government, the regulators, to ensure that the issues of ESG are embedded in the policy formulations of the countries. So this research came at a very good time because we are working on the ground, supporting the government, policymakers, mining companies, communities on issues around sustainability in the region. So I'm going to use the word region, covering South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. So I think, like my previous presenters, what we have discovered is that in the region, the role of the mining company is very important in terms of employment creation, economic growth, forex generation. The mining sector plays a very important role in these three countries. Again, what is equally important is that we are seeing that there is an evolution of ESG or sustainability in the region, where slowly policymakers are beginning to appreciate and trying to enforce sustainability in terms of as a government policy. So if you go to Zimbabwe, they should practice and embrace responsible mining. If you go to Zambia, the same story echoes again, where the government is trying to incentivize mining companies to also adopt responsible mining. Then in South Africa, again, the government, the regulators, they are now trying to make it mandatory for mining companies to adopt and embrace ESG. In terms of our findings, in the past, what we saw is that because in terms of this study, we looked at the multinational enterprises, we looked at the SMEs, that the small mining companies, we looked at the stakeholders in these countries. What we found out was that traditionally, when you talk about ESG sustainability, the MNEs, the big corporates, traditionally they led the process on ESG, largely because of their shareholding, largely because of who the parent company are. So you talk of Zimplus, Mimosas of this world, Implus, the issue of ESG sustainability is something that they do on a daily basis because of the nature of their shareholding, where their headquarters are, because of the issue of where they're exporting their products. And hence, they are more used to the issue of sustainability. However, if you look at the small SME companies, some of them, because of how they are configured, you then find that their adoption of GRI reporting standards tends to be very low compared to the big MNEs. So is that we are seeing now there is voluntary adoption of sustainability by these big MNEs. We are also now seeing mandatory actions or initiatives from the government themselves to try to compel these mining companies to adopt sustainability practices in terms of their day-to-day operations. However, the key challenge is that in some cases, like if you look at Zambia, they are still in their infancy in terms of the journey. If you look at Zimbabwe, they have now made it compulsory for all listed companies to adopt sustainability reporting. South Africa, again, all listed companies on the JSE are now it's now mandatory for them to report on ESG sustainability reports and the like. However, what we also found out was that although there's this push from the regulator, there are no penalties for not reporting. So you can have a policy in place to say all listed companies, they should report. But what will happen if they don't report? So there's the issue of capacity building on the part of the companies. There's also the issue of regulatory gaps to say if companies don't report, what will happen? They will promise to report, but then what will happen? So again, there is regulatory gaps in terms of lack of clarity to say if those listed companies on the JSE, Zimbabwe Stock Exchange don't report, what will happen to them in terms of penalties and the like. So one of the key issues that we also looked at is we're looking at to what extent are mining companies adopting GRI standards in the region. Again, and knowledge on GRI reporting, sustainability reporting is somewhat different from Zimbabwe and Zambia. I think when you go to Zambia, they're really in their infants. The copper mines that my colleague spoke about, most of them, they don't really care much about all these issues. They focus on the bottom line. If you go to Zimbabwe again, you find that the big M&Es, some of them are aware of the GRI standards. Some of them, they're embracing sustainability reporting. But again, you have got these SMEs who have got nothing to do with, their understanding is very low, and they don't embrace this in their day-to-day reporting. So again, you could see that there's a gap where there's need, if you go to Zambia, to work with the government, regulators, stakeholders, to ensure that they embrace GRI standards on reporting, to work with them to ensure that they move towards sustainability reporting in terms of the journey. In some cases, we also found out that some companies, when you talk to them, they say, of course, we are aware of ESG, of course, we are aware of sustainability in terms of the culture, we need to embrace it. But you don't get a sense that they are doing this because they believe that it's the right thing to do. Some of them, in our interaction with them, you find that you get a sense that they are doing it because they are ticking boxes, because they should comply with the regulation, and it's about just waiting to report. But when you look at sustainability, the focus is not on reporting. The focus should be on the journey that you're walking, beginning of the year to year end. So in our study, we found that some companies, they are doing it to just ticking boxes. They don't really live through ESG sustainability on a daily basis, which I think, again, presents also a lot of challenges in terms of information gap, because you need to report what you have been doing the whole year. But if you are focused on just ticking the boxes, it means the focus is just say, how do I fill in the report and just submit? So again, there's need to work with the stakeholders, the companies themselves, to ensure that they really embrace focus on the issues across the year. We also looked at the issue of reporting on labor issues. Again, our experiences are almost the same as Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Zambia. We found that there are issues of technical gaps on why companies are not reporting on labor issues, human rights, labor conditions. That explains why, if you look at some of these countries, almost every year there are always conflicts between the labor Data management deficiencies were also highlighted. Staff capacity to report on that was also picked as some of the key issues. Confidentiality concerns were also picked as one of the major issues. Why companies are not reporting on labor in the region. I think the issue is even more bigger when you go to SMEs in terms of the labor reporting. So again, from the studies, we found that there's need for us to work with the government, the stakeholders, the companies themselves to ensure that they embrace and adopt the standards to ensure that they report on labor issues. Then on tax, again, reporting on tax is another major issue that we focused on. I think the response were quite similar, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Zambia. I think tax issues, if you go to the private sector and start talking about tax issues, it's a very sensitive area. And naturally, there's a lot of secrecy around tax disclosures. So our finding there again were not surprising in terms of the views of the stakeholders that we spoke about in terms of reporting on tax disclosures in the mining sector. I think most stakeholders, they're not really doing much in terms of reporting on the tax standards, largely because of issues of lack of transparency, opaqueness of that aspect of their operations. So, and I think it's actually consistent with our expectations. Again, there's a call for further reforms around that to support our stakeholders to ensure that they can then adopt tax disclosures as a way of increasing transparency, accountability within the operations of these mining companies. I think my colleague earlier on spoke about the need to really enforce accountability, transparency within the mining companies. So in conclusion, what are some of the key recommendations that we came up with from the study? I think from a policy perspective, I think I spoke about the need to have mandatory ESG disclosure framework in the region. I said in Zimbabwe, the focus is on listed companies. In South Africa, again, the focus is really on the listed companies. But I think when you look at the role of the mining companies in these economies in the region, there's need to really move towards mandatory disclosure enforcement by the government and other key stakeholders to ensure that all the companies, all the players in the mining sector disclose and embrace ESG. In Zimbabwe, they are now working on a new responsible mining initiative where they want to come up with minimum standards in the mining sector, where all the players in the mining sector, be it the big companies, the SMEs, the small players, they all adhere to the minimum standards on sustainability. So I think that move will help because if you look at the issue of sustainability in the region, it was mainly left to the big corporates who are exporting to the EU markets, who demands and require these standards. But if you look at the biggest, some of the biggest culprits in the mining sector, it's all the players who are doing business in the sector, who are causing harm to the environment, land displacements and the like. So it's important to really have a new framework in the region that makes it compulsory for all the players in the mining sector to adhere to minimum standards on ESG and sustainability, irrespective of the size of what? The mining companies. The issue of capacity building, I think it also emerges as a key recommendation, I think, across the region. There's need for more capacity building, focusing at the policymakers, because in this study, we spoke to policymakers. Their knowledge on these issues are also very limited. And you can see that if the policymaker understanding is very limited, what more of on-the-ground implementation? So again, it's one key area that we need to work closely with GRI to ensure that we support the policymakers, the regulators, and the mining companies themselves to work on this journey in terms of embracing. If you go to any company, any person no one is going to say to you, I'm a bad player. It's natural. So the issue of greenwashing is a key risk that we also discovered. When we spoke to stakeholders, they all have got very good stories, which at times you may think that probably you're at a wrong company, because before you go there, you will have done your background checks in terms of what does the community say, civil society, and the like. But now when you engage with the companies, they will tell you a very different, a very rose picture in terms of how they respect human rights, labor conditions, and the like. But on the ground, you may find different conditions. So what are we saying? The issue of assurance becomes very important. When companies publish their annual reports, it's very important, it's very good that they are showing you what they've done, but again, I think you need the validation process, a third party, to just come and just validate to what extent is what the company is saying true. Engage the community, other stakeholders to just validate that process. I think it's very important because at times companies may come up with very rosy picture, but on the ground, something could be happening. So one of the key recommendations is to work closely with the communities, the government, and the companies themselves to provide external assurance of the published reports. On labor and tax reform, I think the issue of labor inclusion is also very important. Tax reforms, again, to work with the government and other regulators to ensure that they embrace and publish and focus on tax disclosure, I think is another key recommendation that we also came up with. I think in short, that does gives you a brief summary of our findings in the region. I think there are more opportunities to collaborate and use the current study to then move to the next step in terms of how do we close the gaps that we have in the region, how do we work with the stakeholders, both the government, the regulators, to ensure that there is a proper integration and adoption of sustainability reporting by the mining companies in the region. I thank you.
Thank you, David. And perhaps in this coming discussion, we should look into some of the reasons what is hindering the assurance and verification and explore and find some solutions around that. In the interest of time, I'm going to please ask us to be back in the room at 10 to 12 to start with the next panel discussion that will be facilitated by Dr. Ross Harvey, the Chief Research Officer at Good Governance Africa. Thank you.